Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it is the second part of my review of the miniseries version of Stephen King's The Shining. In part one, we went over the basic overview of this miniseries set at the Overlook. Can't go against a good pun. Now we're going to be talking about the episodes proper. Now there's 3 episodes, so there's going to be 2 more parts after this. This is, of course, episode 1. Now this episode sets up the general premise of the story and puts our characters in the situation they're going to find themselves out for the rest of it. And we're going to essentially learn what the status quo is and what will end up shaking up the status quo. It begins with Jack Torrance at the Overlook. And he is talking, of course, with Pete, who, of course, is played by the actor that reminds me of my grandfather, as I mentioned in part 1, Pat Hingle. Being shown through the Overlook. Okay, this is our boiler, and you want to make sure it doesn't creep up and blow sky high. Now, that's one plot element that was not present in Kubrick's original one, so I don't fault King with everything he's had to say about that version. Having that be the introductory scene to not only set up the basic premise, introduce us to a more accurate novel version of Jack Torrance, and also throw Pete in there, but also to throw in a little Chekhov's gun, because you all know you're not going to mention that there is a boiler in the basement, that a lot of its safety fixtures are crap. The manager is not going to replace. And it will blow sky high once it goes over a certain part, even if you try to take out the steam, unless you're going to have that fire. Now, of course, in the continuity of Kubrick's film, that doesn't become a plot element until the adaptation of Dr. Sleep, but that was many years in the future by the time that they made this miniseries. A couple decades, actually. Now, Jack learns what he can about it. Pete tells him a couple stories about the Overlook, so we start to get a feel of the history of the Overlook Hotel. We get that a little bit in Kubrick's one, but that one, other than the backstory about the previous caretaker, and then seeing all the ghosts, it's more show don't tell in that one, which in certain regards works. But then you also got one cinematic release, whereas here you got a 3-part miniseries where each episode without commercials is around 90 minutes. So you got more story to play with. So doing what the novel can do and actually expanding on that story makes sense. Of course, while he's there, we get the character of Stuart Ullman, played by Elliot Gould. And he actually does a pretty good job playing this character. This is book Ullman to a T. Like I mentioned, I like how I like the performance in the Kubrick one. I like the actor fine, but that's not Stuart Ullman. That's Ullman in name only. Here we get proper Ullman from the book, where he's such a prick. I mean, one of the first lines in the book sums up how much of a prick he is, because it's Jack Torrance thinking that this guy is such a prick. Nice way to start the book off, if you think about it, and also go with Jack's anger issues. Now, with that, Ullman, you really get the feeling he really is a prick. And just watching that season, more scenes here than I remember him being in the last time I watched it. So might have been my memory then when I was doing it all in one, but he was in more in the first part than I remember him. And of course, it's most of what he does plot-wise in the beginning, where he's talking with Jack, telling him, I don't really appreciate the fact that you got hired on as a caretaker at this beautiful hotel. You got hired by people above my head, so we're doing this under duress because of what happened last year. The whole previous caretaker offered himself and his family because of alcoholism, and it's like we hired another alcoholic who's barely a year away from the bottle, which all valid concerns you can understand, especially since Ullman is the type of guy that wants to cover up any major scandal that's involved with a hotel, which you can get, because they say no publicity is bad publicity. In certain circumstances, that's accurate, but then there are times where, that publicity is bad publicity. And in the case of an older lady going to a hotel with a young man and then killing herself in the bathroom once he leaves, I'd say that's bad publicity. So a story like that yeah, you would not want that getting out. So I could see why he decides to do that. Of course, after we see the whole fun stuff with Jack Torrance at the hotel, we're introduced to his wife and son, Winnie and Daniel Torrance. And we could definitely see that they are affected by the choices that Jack has made. And we hear one of them before we see them, and that is him beating up one of his students after he quit drinking. And of course, that student, he cut him from the debate team and he decided to go pop his tires. Now, it's understandable that he would get that guy in trouble if it was out in the streets, even though it's kind of against the law to, because you cross into assault territory. You could understand why he would beat the shit out of him, even if you can't legally condone it for just popping tires, even though he has a knife. But seeing as the situation is in, you're like, oh, frick, Jack, you really had to do that? Of course, since he hadn't been drinking for a while, definitely one of the side effects of him recovering from alcoholism at play. Oh, I don't know that. Now we can debate whether it's going to actually be the withdrawals or something else, 'cause 5 months, but definitely a side effect from him not drinking, and plus his own latent anger issues, as we'll see. Now his wife and son definitely still affected by all the decisions he's made, more financially. I mean, when he could potentially get a job if she wants, because Daniel is old enough. More so in the film version here than he is in the book. If I remember right, he's still a little bit younger in the book, but here they try him a little bit older because of the actor choice. Which, of course, for some of the character decisions might be like, okay, that's a little weird. It doesn't make as much sense with the age that the character looks versus what he's supposed to be, but that's neither here nor there. Now, like I said, they're affected by it. And they're happy that he got the job. And then we're shown, right in this part, that Daniel, he has a sense for these things. His parents don't go as far to say it's like a sixth sense, precognition, but we see pretty quickly that's what it is. Just like in the original, Danny gets a visit from Tony, who, and that one is portrayed more as like his imaginary friend, maybe like a disembodied voice if you go with his shining ability, as it will learn it's called. Probably just him trying to reconcile the fact that he's hearing or feeling things and it being like another thing. Here it's actually a vision of someone older, which this is going to be a spoiler right away, but it is mentioned in the book near the end, and they hinted it early on in a good scene that I don't remember if it's in this one yet. Where it's like, you guys, I don't even think you realize why the boy's name is Tony yet. And that is that Tony is a manifestation of Danny's older self. I mean, his middle name is Anthony. Tony's short for Anthony. And at the end, when we see an older Danny, that's made even more clear. Now, why it's a manifestation of his older self, they never really point on if it's his older self just sending him visions, or if, like with the Kubrick one, him doing the whole thing could be a manifestation and a way for him to reconcile the visions and the voices. It could be a way to reconcile dark visions like that is shining, especially since it's so strong here, is conjuring up these visions so he can make sense of it and not go crazy. Now, if it's his future self, they kind of don't mention that in Dr. Sleep, but it could also be that it's past that point, so he's not really mulling on it. So it's more likely just a side effect of his shining power being so strong at this age. Now he gets the vision from Tony about the Overlook Hotel, about how he shouldn't go there, about how it's dangerous, and of course it scares the crap out of Danny, but not really much he can do. He's not really in a position to tell his dad, no, Dad, you shouldn't take the job. I know we need the money and all that, but you shouldn't take the job. What? Because Tony said we shouldn't go there. I mean, we see that Jack is the one that more or less will humor some of the things that Tony tells him. I mean, he believes him to a point, but you can definitely tell he's humoring him in certain cases. But when it comes to that, like, yeah, he's not going to go with that. Now, the family does go up to the Overlook Hotel, and we really do get to see that they really are down in the dumps because their car is on its last legs. You know, a scene of people honking behind them. The thing that really got me watching this scene is like the van went in front of them. Wow. And again, I shouldn't be that surprised. I mean, I've seen a lot of vehicles just driving in my part of California that should not be going around. Other vehicles do it. And out here, I find it's usually the people driving the larger trucks that do that, where it's like, really, there's no reason you should be speeding up that far to go around a vehicle that's going the speed limit. You know, as my grandfather used to say, more applied to motorcycles that would like to weave in and out of traffic, but you could also put in a situation like that, they're late for their own accident. Now they get to the Overlook, and if you've seen the Kubrick version, some of this is going to feel familiar because this scene is one of the parts that's verbatim out of the book. They just change it around a little bit. Whereas in the original, and if I remember right, in the book, it's Dick Halloran, played in this one by Melvin Van Peebles, who shows Winnie and Jack around the kitchen. In this one, it's Pete. So expanding on his role a little bit, and it's nice to hear these lines delivered by Pat. You know, showing about the kitchen. You know, it may be bigger, but it's still a kitchen. A lot of this stuff you'll never even have to touch. Stuff like that. And, of course, seeing Dick Halloran. Now, Melvin doesn't really have the same presence in the character as Scatman Crothers did, but there is a charm Melvin gives that you could see why Jack and Winnie take a slight shine to him, and definitely why Danny becomes fast friends with him. You know, especially because of their shared power, and of course why Dick decides to become a mentor to Danny when it comes to being at the Overlook with The Shining. And that scene, it doesn't have that same type of creep vibe, and I don't mean creep in the negative way, I mean like in a tone way, you know, like fitting the rest of the tone of Kubrick's film. That one does, and it doesn't really have the same like auditory thing. It's played a little bit more straightforward. Especially with Dick trying to play off how he knows Danny's nickname is Doc. You know, as in, yeah, what's up, Doc? Reviewing without a parachute, are we? But that straightforwardness works for the tone of this miniseries. And the whole conversation between Danny and Dick is pretty heartfelt. I mean, Melvin is the one carrying it, because I'm going to put it this way. Cortland, at this part, I wouldn't say he's a bad actor, but he's not the best. I mean, there's scenes in the miniseries so far in this first part that I think he does all right, and other ones where I'm like, yeah, he's not doing the best. But part of that you could also go is the fact that the character's supposed to be written a little younger than what he was at this point. So, like I said, it's neither here nor there, but it's the writing that carries it a little bit more, I have to say there. And with how the miniseries is shot, I know I haven't really touched on that. I may even talk about story beats, but Mick Garris, he actually does a pretty decent job of shooting it. I mean, this is the era that when a movie was made for TV, it had a very distinct look about it. I mean, I haven't really watched many made-for-TV movies in the last decade, but I think it has the same type of distinct look. But a made-for-TV movie in the 80s and 90s, and I'm talking about one made directly for TV, not one that was made for video and then was shown on TV later, although that one also had its own feel depending on the budget and tone. They really had their own type of feel, these made-for-TV ones, and here is no exception. Now, they're filming it like a movie, but it definitely does have that feel in certain shots. Even with how the camera moves and all that, it definitely doesn't shake that thing. It's not like you're going to mistake this for a cinematic film. But even for that, for a TV one, the cinematography is pretty good here. And there's not really a lot of elaborate special effects in this first part. It's more subtle stuff. You know, the way it's edited, the way that shots are lined up by Mick and his cinematographer. And of course, the sound editing. And that's mainly in the parts where they're visiting specific rooms, like when Dick shows them the presidential suite, which has one of the best views of the Rockies. And while everyone's enjoying it, Danny is starting to get that weird vibe about the murder that happened up there with the shotguns. If I remember right, that was a mafia-style one. So he's starting to get that bad feeling. Which, of course, this is after his conversation with Dick, where he's told him that most of the stuff here can't hurt you. It's just like pictures in a book. Which, of course, is true for the most part, but as we're going to find out later, there is a point where it crosses that threshold to where it's no longer just pictures in a book. It actually can manifest. Now, that partially is going to be due to Danny's presence and how much Shining stuff he has there and how much fear and all that they're feeding off of. So there's that. Now, once Dick and Pete leave, it's now just the Torrances there for the winter. And of course, Jack is settled in in or settling into his role as a caretaker. His first big issue, of course, is having to deal with wasps. Now, if you're doing a 3-part, this is a little subplot from the book you can include, so I'm not surprised they put it here. If they had done what I think they should have done and made it just a 2-parter, you could have ended or had one of the next plot points for the next part be the ender here, but having this part for a 3-part works, but in 2-parter, this would have been one of the things on the cutting room floor. There's a reason why Kubrick didn't have it in his. Because it adds a little bit to the creepiness, as we'll see, because the wasps regenerate after Jack kills them, and that's the hotel, one of the first little things playing with them, and of course they all get a little stung by these wasps. But it's, in the grand scheme of a movie, unnecessary, but in a miniseries that you gotta kill time for, it's there. Of course, adds a little tension because Winnie's all mad. I thought you said they were dead. And of course, this is following Danny having a little episode in the bathroom, which played a little bit on Jack's temper, which leads to him accidentally hitting him against the toilet with his anger. Another little spat between Winnie and Jack. And this is, of course, after we found out about the arm incident, which they do have that in the original one, but it's talked about in dialogue, which that's one of those scenes of like, really? You're so matter of fact there, Winnie. Whereas here we actually get a flashback of it. Now, we don't actually see Jack grab the arm and twist it, however he ends up doing it, but it's a flashback nonetheless, and it's one of the ones that really shows off Jack's temper when it can get that way, and of course, his regret following it, which really is going to hone in with later scenes too, and really does sum up a lot of how his character is before the hotel gets his mitts in him, but also if you look at it as this is how somebody who's dealing with an addiction or just come out of an addiction and is still dealing with it is going to be. Now, we get some of that in the original, but since King wrote the teleplay for this after he cleaned his life up, you can't help but wonder how much of that seeped into his teleplay version of Jack. I'd say a good amount of it, especially in scenes like that, and Steven does a pretty good job of doing it. And I'm going to put it here, he does a better job of playing crazy Jack Torrance than Jack Nicholson does, but then again, that's because with Jack Nicholson, he plays him where you think there's something wrong, a little off about him from the start, whereas here, I mean, there's something off about this Jack Torrance. I mean, he has his anger issues, he has alcoholism, but you can see he's a man who's trying to better himself and turn his life around, and you feel a little sorry for him, but depending on how you look at things, that sorry is going to go for a point. Me coming from a family with a lot of addicts in it, I do appreciate the fact that his character is trying to turn it around and at least making the effort to try to be there. Now, they never mention what number of times this is here, but I'm guessing this is time number 1, and if I'm remembering it right from the book, that is what it is. So yeah, it gets a little bit more sympathy from me than, let's say, somebody who's on their 15th try. And yes, that is coming from having watched my mother do that and be like, yeah, no, she's had more than enough chances at this point. Cold turkey. Of course, that's really where the story in the first part ends. It goes all the way from him getting the job all the way up to this first little incident. We do get some creepy little sets of cinematography where it's hinting at the power that's in the Overlook that's starting to wake up. Partially because the fact that they got humans there alone for the winter, and also because one of them has The Shining. And it does build that little sense of dread and ominous, and like I mentioned, since it does have that TV feel, it does it that way, but it does do it pretty decently. Now, I mean, there's a whole thing about, hey, you can't do PG-13 horror. I don't really think that is an absolute. You can, but you gotta sacrifice the gore and a little bit more of that edge you can get with a horror and compensate for it with dread and insinuation. I mean, a lot of the classic horror films from the early '80s, some of them I would not say would be R, some of them would probably strat that line of R and PG-13, but the ones I definitely say would not be R, they work because of implication and dread and the tone with it. Now, some of them are horror only because they involve monsters, but then you'd put them in that subcategory, but it can be done. I just think that, you know, because of the 70s and the 80s, the golden age of slasher films, and then even some of the ones in the 90s, kind of got spoiled a little bit on gore, but it can be done. It's just you got to know what you're doing in order to make it work. You can't just put somebody in there with no talent, tell them make a PG-13 horror movie, and then expect it to work. That's going to get failure. I mean, you probably couldn't even give them an R-rated horror film and expect that to work unless you tell them this is the type of tone we want from it and all that. But so far, now this first part is my whole little thing about the length and the fact they got a three-parter notwithstanding. This first part, actually pretty effective. Sets up the basic story and the characters that we're expected to see. Sets up the Overlook pretty well, and you could tell there's something weird there. I mean, they haven't said the famous line from the novel about it. This inhuman place makes human monsters. And definitely going to lead in up the dread for the next part, because the next part is where the Overlook is really going to start to try to get its hooks inside of Jack, really going to try to get Danny, and it's going to become awake even more than it already is. And of course that's going to lead into the third part where it all concludes, where the Overlook really is awake. Now there's where you're going to really feel some of the TV-ness from what I remember, but we'll talk about that when we get to that stuff. There's not really much interesting trivia to talk about for this part, because everything that pops up is not related to this one, other than the color of the VW Beetle. Is that in the film in the original film they drive a yellow, and they pass a crashed red one, and this is Kubrick's version of saying this was his and not King's, whereas here they drive the red, and of course, it's back to say this is our version of it. Legacy, not the most interesting, but I'm looking to see who we had in the cast other than our main ones that we talked about already. Oh, it's Will Horneff who plays Tony, by the way. And I'm checking to see what Will has done other than this. He was in Born to Be Wild from 1995 as Rick Heller. Oh, he played Phillips in The Sandlot. I haven't seen that in film in ages, so that should tell you what. He played a couple different characters in 2 episodes of Law and Order, one in 93 and one in 2002. He played Taddy in an episode of House from 2005, so probably season 1, maybe beginning of season 2. Apparently, it looks like the last thing he was in was The Longest Swim from 2014, so he's been inactive for almost a decade, so probably just acts what projects he finds interesting, doesn't really need it for the money. Cynthia Garris plays the woman from 217. I'm looking to see if she's only in there. Okay, she does it all the way, so we're going to see her in makeup pretty soon. She was also in Critters 2: The Main Course. She played Susan Stern in The Stand, and she was also in Sleepwalkers. She was in other stuff like an episode of Masters of Horror. She played Ellen Stevens in Psycho 4. She was in the Swamp Thing TV show. And apparently she was one of the zombies in Michael Jackson's Thriller music video. So she's definitely used to acting under makeup, although I think that one probably was heavier since she wasn't expected to give dialogue. We got Thomas Herrera as George Hatfield. Ken Solomon as a basketball player. We got Mickey Giacomazi as the second waiter. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about this. Jack's good buddy Al, who is his sponsor in AA. Like I mentioned, they do bring that up because King actually knows what that is now. So definitely a more modern thing leaking into storytelling. Al is Jack's old buddy, an old drinking buddy. Now, I don't remember if they bring up the story in the second part, but just in case they don't, one of the things that scared them cold turkey is that after a night of heavy drinking, they're driving, they see something in the middle of the road, they accidentally run it over, and it turned out to be a little kid's bike. So they're looking all over the side of the road for the kid they hit. They don't find a body. So they get in the car, and it's basically a scared straight moment for both of them. Now, Al just goes completely cold turkey. Jack, if I remember right, takes a little bit more, but eventually he comes around to it. Now, of course, Jack in his wild, crazy days, they don't touch on everything that he did, which is why there's a little bit of plausible deniability with the timeline when it comes to Jack fathering an illegitimate child. Now, Jan Van Sickle, he's only in one scene, and that's where they're talking over the phone. He does a good job playing Al for what little there is. Let's see what else he was in. He was in Silver City from 2004 as a reporter. He was in flashback from 1990 as a prison guard. He was in the TV movie A Norman Rockwell Christmas Story. He doesn't really has that type of look for that. Oh, he was in a couple of the Perry Mason TV movies that were done near the end of Raymond Burr's life. The Case of the Telltale Talk Show host and The Case of the Wicked Wives. And the former, he played Officer Bates, and the latter, he played a photographer. Oh yeah, he was in an episode of a show from my childhood, Diagnosis Murder, as an officer. And that seems to be about it. Now, something called Broken Fences from '08. That seems to be one of his more recent ones. Doesn't look like he's done a lot of TV or film stuff, so I'm guessing maybe more a theater guy. But he does a good job for what he has to do there. That's really all the top cast one. And whoever played the guy at the bar who lifts his glass to Jack also did a pretty good job for no dialogue. And that's really all I have to say about this part. Like I already mentioned at the top, does a good job setting up the premise. And of course, it'll lead into the second part, which will be next time. Till then, everybody.